Welcome to JAMA Plus AI Conversations. I'm Dr. Roy Perlis, Editor-in-Chief of JAMA Plus AI, and today's host. Welcome to our guest, Dr. Robert Califf, Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Califf, you recently published a special communication in JAMA on the topic of AI regulation, an area where FDA has tried to be proactive in issuing guidance going back a number of years, particularly since 2021. You point out that FDA has approved almost 1,000 devices using AI already, which is sort of counter to the narrative of AI is coming, we better prepare for it. So my question for you, how's it going?
Well, it's a very exciting time to see so many people putting AI into devices, into drug development, dealing with supply chains. It's sort of like everyday life for Americans. AI is ingrained in so much of what we do. We don't even think about it. Then when we talk about it, we act as if it's some separate thing that's going on. But this wave of AI definitely is creating the need for a thoughtful approach to regulation and innovation and how they're balanced.
Why write the paper now versus a year ago or a year from now? What was it that made you and your group say, this is what we want to get out there now?
Well, one of the interesting parts of being an FDA commissioner is that you're sort of at the top of the ship, but there's so much of what the FDA does that's very specific to the industry that's being regulated. And the industry depends a lot on the guidances and rules that come from those specific parts of FDA, typically centers that are regulating those parts of the industry. But in my perch, I get to see the whole spectrum of what's going on. And I felt like it was a good time, and so did my co-authors who are FDA employees. They felt it was a good time to lay out some principles. And the idea here is not to um, precede or override anything the centers would be doing that's specific for the area being regulated, but more the general issues that we're seeing across the spectrum of what we do.
One of the things that you use it as an example in the paper is the sepsis prediction model that you all reviewed. And you talk about regulatory safeguards, which might not be so familiar to some of the folks listening. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about those safeguards, what that means in the real world?
I think oftentimes people have this notion that FDA is like in everybody's manufacturing facility and every supply chain node looking at exactly what's going on. We don't have anywhere near the capacity to do that. And so we're very dependent on the industries following the guidances and regulations and laws that are in place. For example, on farms, we don't inspect every parcel of food. We depend on the farmers to abide by the 10 key rules of the Food Safety Modernization Act. And then what we do is, where it's needed, we put, you could call them guardrails or safety mechanisms in place to sort of channel the industry away from the things that might be dangerous or are dangerous into what we would see as more productive attributes. And I think everybody listening to this probably knows that there's a, now infamous case of sepsis prediction that turned out to get it wrong too often. But we think that for many decision support algorithms, and in fact, as a general principle, if you take a AI algorithm and stick it in a clinical environment, it's going to change depending on the inputs and other factors out in society that affect the outcomes. And so it's got to be monitored like an ICU patient. Think of an AI algorithm like an ICU patient being monitored, as opposed to drugs and devices in the old-fashioned way. You make a drug, you do a clinical trial, it's going to be the same drug for its lifetime. That's not the case with AI. So in the sepsis model that we mentioned, we put special rules into place that call for monitoring the operating characteristics of the outcome of the algorithm after it's put out into the clinical environment.
So I appreciate you making that point because I think most clinicians, to the extent they think about FDA at all, think about its role in that initial approval process, right? And we think about phase 3 trials and getting through FDA. Occasionally you hear about something getting pulled from the market, but by and large, it seems like that initial hurdle is where the bulk of the effort is. Is that a fair characterization, and is that changing with AI?
It's a fair characterization of where we've been with regard to drugs and devices, which is what the clinical world typically thinks about. But remember, we also regulate food, cosmetics, animal drugs and devices, all sorts of other things. It's about 20% of the economy. So that balance of pre-market and post-market is different for each commodity. But Congress passed a law that said you can't sell a medical product across interstate lines without getting approved or cleared by the FDA, depending on the risk level of the product. So for all drugs, it's a high risk. It's very stringent. You have to prove that your drug has benefits that outweigh risks for at least one indication. And then it's traditionally, you characterize it quite well, I think, for those medical products. It's been thought, well, post-market is really just a matter of surveillance for if something terrible shows up. Um, and I'm going to get to where AI, I think, falls in the middle of this. But we've recently been putting out a lot of papers, including your journal, about the fact that at the time even a drug hits a market, what we know is that benefits outweigh risks for one indication in one population. We don't know comparative effectiveness, the value, how long you should give it, how it should be combined with other therapies. But FDA doesn't have authority to require the studies the way we do in the pre-market phase. A lot of people are also mistaken that we just make up the laws. The laws are actually written by Congress, which is elected by you all. So, um, so we have a lot of authority pre-market. You have to satisfy um, the rules of the game, and we referee it. Post-market, I think it's everybody's business that we need to answer these questions rather than leaving it to marketing from the companies. So where does AI fall into this? AI, as it's embedded in a device, or AI as a decision support algorithm, is out there in the market, and we have a joint responsibility in the post-market phase to take a step up in terms of our assessment capabilities. And this is, I think, the biggest area where FDA has a role to play, because there are probably algorithms out there now that haven't been through the FDA being used by health systems where no one knows what the drift is in terms of whether they're accurate, getting better or worse over time. And this is not something the FDA can do on its own. We're going to need clinical health systems and professional societies to get very involved in self-regulation, just like we do on the farms, where if you're a farmer growing vegetables and there's a farm upstream that has cows contaminating the water, it's your responsibility to take that into account. And um, no different here in this post-market phase.
I love AI being compared to farms, but also the fact that it's not a completely new domain, that this is something that y'all have experience in thinking about how to regulate. But still in all, I mean, how do you get the health systems to fall into line? You know, how do you,
Well,
this seems like it requires a lot of back and forth between the systems, the folks making these things, and presumably FDA.
well, I don't want you to turn it just on us. You got a responsibility too. You're the journal of the American Medical Association, right? So um, there's a large amount of mutual accountability here. We are asking Congress for more legal authority to help make this happen. And I'm very worried about it, because I think the main use of AI algorithms today in our health systems is to optimize finances, which unfortunately, given our current payment system, all too often means creating disparities by catering to people who already have money or good insurance. Our accountability is really for safety and effectiveness. We're not allowed to take economics into account. So we are relatively puristic here, and would like to see a system where algorithms are not creating disparities, but improving health. So I think you'll see a consistent drumbeat of that theme by FDA, but we don't have authority to march in and seize algorithms and that sort of stuff that people might imagine. We have to work in an ecosystem and persuade. And if Congress gets worked up, they could pass a law um, giving us more authority. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. So it's going to be mutual accountability. And I think so much of the power lies with the health systems and the clinicians who work in them to demand that when AI is used, that it's used intelligently and that the operating characteristics. If you say you're predicting sepsis, how often are you accurate? What's the sensitivity, specificity, and um, uh, the ability to discriminate sepsis from non-sepsis patients in your prediction? That's got to be continuously looked at to make sure you're doing it right. It's just one of many examples I could give.
In AI in general and computer science more broadly, people love to do bake-offs, right? We love a good bake-off. We bake this model off against another, and now we have leaderboards for these models. Given that traditionally you're not in the business of this is better than that, except maybe this is better than placebo, is that something you think about in terms of how models compare to each other, or is it simply a threshold of it works or it doesn't, right? It has these characteristics or it doesn't.
Well, let's separate our regulatory authority from, if you will, the practice of medicine or the practice of public health. So our regulatory authority is not um, enabling of us to demand comparative effectiveness data. But most of my career outside the FDA was doing large clinical trials, most of which were either phase 3 or beyond, trying to sort out which treatment is best, or how do you combine treatments, or how do you adjust the dose to get a better outcome. All those are relevant to the AI circumstance. And I think you will see increasing bake-offs, as you said it, with in silico data sets or historical data sets. But what we really need is an intact health systems. The beauty here is that if you're comparing predictive algorithms, for example, or decision support, you can probably do a lot of that without the risk to patients of getting the inferior treatment. You can do comparisons. You're running computer algorithms. So there are a lot of ways this could be approached, but it will not be unless something changes an FDA mandated approach. I would think good clinicians would want to know which algorithms are best. And, I still remember an old theory from my pre-FDA days in the field of cardiology. A lot companies did a lot of things they didn't necessarily want to do because the clinical community demanded to know what the best treatment was. And the statement in the guidelines from the clinical trials that were done was extremely important for their bottom line. So if we can build that ethos in the clinical community. So I'm right back at you here. You got a big responsibility in your job with JAMA AI, at least in my view.
So let me try to put the ball a little bit back in your court, knowing your thoughtfulness about trials. I think one of the challenges is that the folks who develop at least new interventions are often reluctant to try new trial designs. And some of that fear comes from, how's it going to play with FDA, right? At least in my area in psychiatry, no one wants to try a new outcome measure. No one wants to try a new study design. Do you think that kind of good old fashioned, phase 3 trial designs are going to serve us well with AI? Or do you think there's some way to move people beyond that with this new kind of technology?
Well, I'd say many areas already move beyond it, and I I don't I don't deny that in historically the standard of the FDA reviewer has been a major issue in trying new things. That's not necessarily because the FDA said you can't try new things, but companies, when they look at the net present value of their product, if you take a risk on a new approach and then it doesn't fly, you got a lot to account for with your shareholders. But I would there are many areas now where that no longer pertains, where platform trials are becoming routine, for example. And I would just say platform trials, basket trials, they're all in play here. And I think it's a wide open field. It may be easier because it's not a matter of pre-market evaluation the way drugs and devices are per se. I should also mention, a lot of people ask, what about in drug development? And FDA is very interested. We have some guidance coming out soon. There's a lot already been written by Cedar and Seaburr about this, drugs and biologics. And so we're interested, our reviewers need to be up to date. Fundamentally, the use of AI in drug discovery and deciphering proteins and all, that's the industry's business. We're interested, but
Mhm.
what happens there is really to produce a drug, which then has to be tested in a clinical trial. And so it's not like the FDA is going to mandate certain approaches to AI in preclinical, early clinical development. And the area of clinical trial design and control groups, synthetic control groups, all that, that is where FDA has a major role to play and will continue to do so.
One of the things you've mentioned is the importance of having reviewers who are sufficiently savvy about AI and methods for studying AI. How are you approaching that at the FDA level? How do you make sure you have the people who understand these tools and can really evaluate them?
Well, there's so much interested in this. We have a lot of quantitatively gifted people and people with experience in digital technologies and computing at every level. So I'm not really worried about our people, at least for right now. Um, we're not having great difficulty hiring. We've got jobs if people are technically qualified and interested. But it's going to be a matter of ongoing effort. Like we just had a 3-day symposium with external industry and academic people coming in, and quantum computing was one of the topics. It's here. And so there are whole new areas that we're going to have to stay abreast of. So very well not understood that it's going to be a challenge. We can't pay what the tech industry is paying, for example, but we got good people, and I'm not worried about their basic understanding.
As an editor, I oftentimes struggle with papers that are cutting edge today, and I worry won't even be cited a year from now, right? Something else will come along. But given how fast things are moving, do you feel we have a reasonable handle on the how we're going to regulate these things, how we're going to apply them, that can keep pace with the way that the technology itself is evolving?
I'd say we're doing better than most people imagine, but um, the field is changing exponentially, not linearly. So it is a worry. And as generative AI comes in, and the whole space of where consumer interactions with devices come into play in the non-medical area, but now are combining, the easy place to think about that is the Apple Watch, for example, with medical indications in the same device, which is a consumer device. Those things are going to be very explosive, and your sample size is in the millions to billions there, so things can move rapidly.
You alluded to language models, and in the paper you sort of single that out as an area where it may be particularly challenging, given that they're not always especially transparent, that we don't fully understand how they work in many circumstances. How are you thinking about that? Do you think language models need particular kinds of controls?
I think, yes, they will need particular kinds of controls, but I don't think anyone knows right now exactly what they should be. There are some exciting opportunities, like having one large language model check the other as a routine constantly because of the risk of hallucinations and making up stuff. And there's some recent examples I was reading about in the paper where that's happened with clinic notes, for example. Could be a big problem. But it keeps coming back to the ecosystem. Are we going to hold each other mutually accountable? We're talking about embedding systems in clinical practice that are constantly changing. So I would think the health systems and clinicians and patients have as much reason to put together systems that can monitor these models and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing as anyone does. And, a special note that's in our paper that I keep bringing up, we've already talked about it a bit, but if, a large language model is basically a set of numbers and words, tuned to a dependent variable. And if that dependent variable is finance, that is going to be bad for health. Yet, if you're running a health system or you're a doctor or a nurse, you need to make a living. So finance needs to be part of that equation. But I would think a big job for the clinical community is what are the components that hold that financial equation accountable for the health outcomes that are engendered. And again, these models will be really good, I think, and they already are in their current form in segregating patients who are profitable from those who are not. Is that the way we want to do this, or do we want accountability built into the system for health outcomes?
And is there a place for FDA in this?
I think for sure there's a place for FDA in the standards and the what makes a good study. Um, what are the outcomes that need to be measured, analytical methods, et cetera. But we can't be out there monitoring every model that's used in the practice of medicine. There's not any feasible way to do this. We're also working to build consortia to help promote the ecosystem that needs to develop. And I don't see that as different than the farms or a good manufacturing practice where we're not in every facility every day. What we're doing is setting standards and helping to build communities of practice for manufacturing complex biologics, for example, which is hard to do. And we have the ability, because we see everything, to share information that each individual company can't do on its own.
In your paper, you kind of call out that industry is really a whole range from kind of big pharmas all the way down to little startups, um, and you do mention academia, which thank you. But how do you think about maintaining an ecosystem where there is a range from big to small? Because these small companies probably don't have the wherewithal to, for example, engage with FDA.
Yeah, this is part of our everyday life. And in every program that we have a set aside preferential resources for the little guys. With devices that, the two people in the garage, um, how are they going to? Well, we don't expect them to have a manufacturing system that's going to produce devices for the entire world with high quality. Their goal is generally to get to the point where they can sell what they're doing to a big distribution company. Um, and it's the same in pharma. For example, INDs and BLA concepts at the origin, the little guys get a break. They don't have to pay like the big pharmas do. So we'll have things that will be preferentially supportive of startups. That's where most of the good ideas come from. But to have a vibrant ecosystem of high quality that's maintained across an entire country or the world, you also got to have the big guys with the reliable, heavy duty capabilities of assuring that quality. So I think this is not new to us, but maybe it's fair to say that it's especially a big issue for things like generative AI and large language models because you got to have a big data set to start with. And so the big guys have a very big advantage here. And it's something that we'll need to work out not just at FDA, but societally.
So a little earlier, you said that you're talking about what you could do within your regulatory authority. And I have to ask, what would make your life easier at FDA? I mean, in a perfect world, Congress passes a law that does what? That would make it easier to regulate AI or make AI safer. What laws would be helpful to you?
Well, I can't go into too much detail here because we're not allowed to talk about laws and progress, but I'd just say generally, I think it would be helpful if we had authority from Congress to set the standards in this post-market phase. And if you go back even 10 years ago, as algorithms were more and more coming in, you had guidances from FDA saying, the pre-market phase is important, but this post-market phase of monitoring the model, what the algorithm is doing is critical. So more authority to make that happen, not to do it, but to say if you're putting an algorithm out there, you should be aware that you could be audited for whether your algorithm is doing what it says. And I think we're very well configured to enforce things in industries that are generally trying to do the right thing. You know, farmers want to grow food that people want to eat. So, as another example. So, as long as we have goodwill, we have the right standards and some enforcement capability, um, I think I think it would help a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Califf.
Yeah, thanks. Good luck to you. Take care.
Bye now. I'm Dr. Roy Perlis, and I've been speaking with FDA Commissioner Dr. Robert Califf about regulation of artificial intelligence. You can find a link to the article in this episode's description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Patrick Lyle and Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. Thanks for joining us.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.